We have the good fortune, the great good fortune now, to be joined by Julia Gillard. She was the 27th Prime Minister of Australia. She was the first woman to serve as Australia's Prime Minister, and she's also the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. She's a great advocate for all areas of girls' and women's rights. And of course, she's also a fantastic historian now, based on her own personal experience of living through history. Julia, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Jude. Great to be with you.
Julia, I really want to ask you to consider the last 24 hours, not that we've made you watch all of it, but in terms of the themes that we addressed, the themes of justice, the themes of education, the themes of health, of violence, of climate change, and of course of money, all of which in this COVID disaster and this moment of revolutionary language and action have demonstrated that the concerns of women are fully intersectional, and that really, this level of injustice is global and not partial. It seems a time when we have to call on women's leadership in a completely different way, that we have to bring women's leadership to the fore and ask different things of it. I wonder whether you'd talk a little bit about that, about what you've seen in COVID, about what women's reactions have been, and where you think women's leadership now has to play a role.
Jude, this is clearly a time of crisis, but also a time of possibility. I've been really heartened to see the world value women's leadership at this time. And we've all seen the pieces in newspapers and magazines that have talked about women leaders, whether it be Jacinda Ardern or whether it be Erna Solberg in Norway, other women leaders around the world, and how they particularly have led with caring and empathy during this crisis. And by contrast, what we've seen is a singular failure of the strong man sort of image of leadership. The men who normally govern with bluster have been the ones who have let the virus do the worst of work in their countries, because that style of leadership simply hasn't kept people safe. So I'm hoping that out of this we can evaluate again what leadership traits we are looking for, and we can have a very honest discussion about what it means to build back better after this crisis. We went into it with inequality, with hyperpartisanship, with nationalism, with the outworking still of the global financial crisis, the crisis of 2008, with all sorts of inequalities that meant when the virus came, whilst we said to each other, we're all in this together, in reality people were in incredibly different positions to face this virus. So I hope that we can, through WOW and more generally, be mobilising a conversation about what it will mean to build back better, not just so that we will be more resilient in the face of a future pandemic, but so that we address the underlying inequalities and exclusions that this pandemic has laid so bare.
We've often talked about we need more women leaders, and we've put that idea into government, into local authority, into the tops of corporates, etc. And generally speaking, people have sort of nodded and made a little bit of room. But I'm wondering whether, when you talk about we need women's leadership, whether it's not just a demand from beneath, but whether it needs to be a responsibility now, not just to ask women to be there, but to say we insist on being there because we have the evidence that actually at this point in time, for whatever reason in the progress of humanity, these are the skills that we now need. We need this experience, and it needs to be women taking over. Now, we've never asked it in that wholesale way before, but would you be prepared to say that's what we need to do?
Well, I certainly don't think we should keep falling for what I refer to as the politics of scarcity. We've been trained over recent years, I think, to say, well, women are coming through. They're coming through for 2 or 3 seats around the table. You know, they're going to be a third of the cabinets that run nations, or maybe they're going to be 20% of corporate boards. And what we then find, of course, is it creates this false competition between women, where women end up striving against each other to get one of those rare spots, instead of us standing back and saying, we're not going to play this game anymore. This isn't about an end point where women are 20 or 30%. This is about an end point where merit and the best of voices truly come through. And if you believe, as I do, that excellence is equally distributed throughout humanity, then that must mean that we should see diverse leadership teams, diverse in every way, including in gender. And so I think we've got to be more assertive about less of the tokenism, the toucanism, the 1 or 2 women who get to sit around the table, and more ambitious about what wholesale change would look like.
Mm-hmm. If women had been in seats of power, I mean, had really had their hands on the levers of power to do with money and the economy, when this moment came of crisis and this huge input, nothing in my lifetime has ever been this moment of fiscal input into economies all over the world to stem the hemorrhaging. And yet we had today the evidence that that fiscal input hasn't been set through a gender lens at all. Now, if women had been in charge of those economic choices, would that have been different? Would we have been able to make sure that all of the debris that we're seeing around women's security, around women's health, around the violence issues, around women's economic jeopardy at this point, that might have been very different, might it not, if women's experience had been part of that leadership and fiscal distribution?
Well, we do know from the evidence that when women are around decision-making tables as equal partners, not just as a token voice, but actually included, we do know that women tend to bring policies that extend peace and security. For example, the evidence shows that when societies have been war-torn, if women are partners in bringing about the peace, then the peace will last longer than if women are excluded. We know that women have brought to the fore issues in decision-making that have been historically neglected, about reproductive health and choices, about childcare, about the undervaluing of women's work. So I do think, that the evidence is very clear that including a diversity of opinion gives you a better outcome. But Jude, I am very conscious that as we go through this pandemic era, we will move from the intensity of the health crisis to even more addressing the economic crisis, the rebuilding. And one thing I think we've got to guard against is an analysis and a set of behaviours which says, well, women's leadership's been fine when we were dealing with the health crisis because women are empathetic and nurturing and caring and they're good at that kind of stuff. But now we're really dealing with the economic crisis that is historically more been the preserve of men. We're the ones who do the money things and the big infrastructure things. And at that point, there is more of a squeeze as to who gets to make the decisions. I think we've got to be very forewarned and forearmed about that risk, that in 12 months' time and in 2 years' time, we won't be having the same dialogue about the need for women's leadership in the economic rebuilding unless we force it.
Yeah, and tell me, how are we going to force it, Julia?
Well, I think, one, we've got to keep talking about it. Unless we shine a light on these things, then they won't come to the fore. And one thing that I'm, really optimistic about in this sense is I don't think that a number of the issues that have been under discussion during this pandemic, the impact of school closures in developing countries on girls' education and girls' life chances, the fact that this is predominantly a women's recession, the jobs that have been lost are predominantly women's jobs, the value of women's leadership, the value of the caring professions, who keeps us going as a society when push comes to shove. You know, overwhelmingly it's women who have been in the front line of caring for others as the pandemic has hit. I think we wouldn't have had that, you know, those issues at the forefront of the dialogue if we hadn't had women campaigning for so many years in the lead up to this pandemic. And I think that should give us an optimistic flavour that if we do keep campaigning, we do keep talking, we do keep pushing, then we can make change.
What I've noticed is that the loneliness that female leaders have had to endure over many years. I mean, watching you give that extraordinary misogyny speech all those years ago in Australian Parliament, the loneliness of women leadership seems to me to be less likely now as women stop internalizing the idea that they don't want to belong to the women's group because it's better to be on the men's group because it has more power. And I think that women are beginning to say we need to be sisters. We need to stand together. We need to stand together across the divides that have been made for us. And do you think that's true? Do you think that powerful women who were previously told that, you know, they may not want to be with the girls because that wasn't such a great place, do you think powerful women are now being asked to say, you've got to stand up for the rights that were won for you by making sure that you're getting rights for the next generation of girls? Is the language of female leadership one of greater solidarity than it used to be?
I think the answer to that is definitely yes. And I have a book coming out, which I wrote with an African friend of mine, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, whom, amongst many other things, is the chair of the Global Vaccine Alliance. So you couldn't have a more important position during a pandemic than that. And we have, in putting the book together, interviewed 8 women leaders, you know, conservative women, progressive women, you know, Theresa May from the United Kingdom, Hillary Clinton, Michelle Bachelet from Chile, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Joyce Banda, and the list goes on, Jacinta Ardern, Erna Solberg, you know, women from across the world and across the political spectrum. And they all participated in those interviews and discussions because they clearly felt this sort of solidarity, and they wanted to be in a discussion that was bringing women's leadership to the forefront, and they wanted to be in a discussion where they could share what they had learned with the generations who are coming up now. And, you know, there's a difference between chronological generations and political generations. So not just with young women, but with a woman of any age who is still on a journey into decision making, into leadership. They wanted to share their insights. And so I've left that gathering of their interviews and their words of wisdom very optimistic about the way in which women want to band together, to be seen to band together, to be unafraid to do that, to be less concerned than women were in the past about, you know, just being seen to bang on about women's issues. I think a lot of that kind of negative stereotyping we've left behind us. And so that does seem to me to mean that we're all getting more open, more assertive, more collective about this endeavour around women and leadership and how big the changes we want to see are and how we're going to push for them.
Mm-hmm. The new book, by the way, folks, which comes out on the 12th of July in Australia and New Zealand, and then in the autumn in the UK and a little bit later in the US, is called Women in Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons. It's going to be great to hear that because, as you say, when women start stopping themselves being so cautious, getting away from the idea that women have to be nice and reasonable all the time, calling stuff out as it really is, demanding change quickly rather than slowly, not being grateful for having the right to your rights, you know, this will change and accelerate. From Zilli from the UN yesterday talked about radical impatience and saying that, you know, it is completely unreasonable not to have radical impatience now. The scale of change that's needed versus the slowness of the progress, it just isn't acceptable. And I'm wondering, finally, for this moment, Julia, before I turn to two of my other guests, I'm going to come back to you at the end. But just to think about the impact that Black Lives Matter has had on all of us. For myself as a cisgendered white woman from the UK, growing up at a time when I wasn't given any information that would help me understand the complexity of our history. And therefore, no matter how well-intentioned and good you think you are, you will have hard-baked inside you attitudes that your country and your culture has given you. Unlearning stuff as fast as you possibly can in order to make a just world that you want to belong to. This is something which we have to accelerate, isn't it? And what do you observe in Australia and across the world has happened as a result of this new moment of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, there was a set of gatherings here in Australia too around Black Lives Matter, as this has swept the world, the US and then in other nations. For us, it's been about facing again the issue of how our justice system treats and discriminates against Indigenous Australians who are incarcerated at truly shocking rates, and many have died in custody. And there have been inquiries and commissions over years and years and years, but clearly not enough has changed, because we still have Indigenous Australians who, for non-payment of fines and things like that, end up in prison cells, and some of them don't survive the experience. So for us in Australia, this is about a reckoning with our own history, and it's a connected history to the UK, but a different history. A woman of my age in school was largely taught that Australian history started when Captain Cook arrived. Now, of course, kids are taught about the thousands and thousands of years of Indigenous history in Australia, our First Peoples, and their special connection to land, and what a privilege it is to live in a nation that has the oldest continuing culture on earth. But there is still so much more to do if we are to address the weight of history and everything that has brought to modern Australia in terms of discrimination and exclusion.
So this Black Lives Matter moment is accelerating change that has to happen all around the world in many different cultures. I was just speaking to Senator Sherry Rahman in Pakistan, and she was saying it's allowed people to call out colorism in Pakistan. It's allowed people to ban products overnight for skin whitening. So it's having a profound effect in terms of the language of change. And I suppose finally, that is one of the most exciting things, isn't it? That you're often taught that coming out in the streets, making a protest, being disturbing, being demanding, that this is somehow, not useful, and one should just pipe down and let the democratic processes go forward. But there are times when citizens have got to raise their voice. And she was saying that they are beginning to look at their whole police system and saying that they can't accept any longer the way policing is done, and they'll have to dismantle the police, or at least inquire as to whether that's happening, whether that's possible to happen. Do you think institutional change of that radical nature can be expected now from our societies?
I certainly think that this is a moment that is pregnant with possibility, because so many people around the world have rallied and rallied so intensively to this cause. But I am still very anxious, Jude, about the forces of reaction and backlash. And I know here in Australia, and from looking at the situation around the world, that we have seen endeavours to try and get change in the past that clearly haven't worked. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this moment. If those past endeavours had worked, we wouldn't be here. So I'm partially energised and enthused about the wave of energy that's in the demands now, but I'm also very thoughtful about how much it's going to take to bring the kind of change that people are asking for. So I don't think we can take anything for granted. I think it would be wrong for us to say so many people have mobilised, change will come. There's a big gap between the mobilisation and securing the change, and we've got to keep working to fill that gap.
Okay, thank you. Julia, I'll come back to you, but thank you for now. I'm going to now go to Nimco Ali, OBE, somebody who's been part of the WOW movement since we started it 10 years ago. Welcome, Nimco. She's a Somalian British social activist and writer. She co-founded Daughters of Eve and was named by the Sunday Times as one of Debrett's 500 most influential people in Britain. She's also the founder of the Five Foundation and has been central in positioning FGM as a key issue in ending violence against women. So, Nimco, really pleased to have you as always, and really pleased that you're able to make the time when I know that this particular period for your work has been so intense. You'll have to do so much labour to educate everybody about what we need to know, and also fight for policy change, financial change, and care change to bring about the things that you believe in and have to be done. You said to me before we came on air that there was a kind of a huge issue that COVID not had just revealed, but was intensifying in terms of girls' and women's safety. I wonder what you feel that COVID has done as far as you're concerned across the globe.
Hi, Jude. Thank you for having me, and thank you for always caring about the most vulnerable girls on the planet and giving them a platform on WOW. Yeah, one of the things that COVID has done is that it's really laid bare how unequal and ineffective the kind of that development model is. So one of the key things of why we started the Five Foundation was to actually say that local activism and funding local women who are doing the work was the only way to end issues like FGM. So as soon as COVID hit and a large of the large NGOs and the bilaterals had to pull out, it meant that the issues that they were funding or the issues that they were tackling still happened. So at this moment, as we speak, we have millions of girls with no resources and no protection from things like FGM, domestic violence, child marriage, and also rape. So even in the most successful country, which has been doing some great work on FGM, Kenya, which was honestly on target to end FGM by 2025, has now gone backwards. In certain communities in the West Pokot area, in the last 2.5 weeks, over 500 girls have been subjected to FGM. In other parts of Kenya, 4,000 teenage girls have been impregnated. And when I say impregnated, that's either through incestuous rape, either through child marriage, or just the fact that these girls are out of school, so they're being taken advantage of. So what COVID has done is really show that the way that we are trying to make the world better from a Western perspective is not working. And a lot of the work that has been happening has been very racist and sexist. And I think for me, I've spent the last almost 18 months trying to get the development sector to understand that they needed to invest and trust women. A lot of those weren't interested. And what's been fascinating is that in the last 4 or 5 months, it's been the private sector that has actually come in and tried to support the most vulnerable women.
Yeah, I go a little bit deeper into this because I think this kind of idea that the NGO world was there to sort of save and support vulnerable people, it carries, it's laced, isn't it, with exactly the same issues of, you know, the people who have power telling the people who have no power how they are going to receive help. And as you've said, when those agencies have left, it is still women mainly on the ground doing the stuff. And yet they're not the ones that are given the money. They're not the ones that are given the power or the seat at the table. So what do we do about that, Nimco? Tell us what to do.
It's actually funding women, so it's very simple. The roots of FGM and a lot of the inequalities in Africa is about economic injustice. At the moment, women in Africa are not seen as the human capital of a country. So we talk about this idea of ending poverty, but you can't end poverty if 51% of your population is either uneducated, has been forcibly subjected to FGM, or has been married off as children. So FGM at a community level adds value to girls by meaning that you can sell them as primitively as for 2 extra cows. But on a central government level, it's costing governments and it's costing countries billions of dollars on an annual basis because of the fact that there's like early death, complications from the health of FGM, psychological issues. So for me, it's like if you give women the ability to be able to make money and make choices, which has happened to us in the West. There's the reason why women in the West have the rights that they do today is because we were allowed to work, we were allowed to open bank accounts, and our grandmothers fought for that. If we give African women the ability to be able to work and to be able to bank their dollar, then they can choose when they get married, who they get married to, and how many kids they have. I am really irritated and tired of having to tell Western white women that the only thing that African women need is to have their awareness raised of FGM. We have experienced FGM, so we know it's bad. And also this concept of the first thing that we need as African women is the ability to have access to contraception. We can have access to contraception if we have access to documentation. That means we can democratically vote for people that can give us that. The idea that we're spending $800 million on UN agencies that just talk about contraception and nothing about empowering and giving documentation to women is quite problematic. But for me, I'm thinking that if the UK has made this announcement that it's going to roll DFID, which is the Department for International Development, into the FCO and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And I'm thinking, well, this is a real opportunity that if one of the global economic powers can really start, pushing a feminist forum. There is nothing wrong. I also want to say that there is nothing wrong with the US and the UK and other countries that have given women certain rights to go to African countries and say that we believe in democracy, women's rights and human rights, and actually really tie that with development. At the moment, what we're doing is that we're giving people millions of dollars, but then at the same time not saying anything politically and diplomatically about 70% of their girls being out of education, 70% of their girls being forcibly married off into what is institutional rape and subjected to FGM. So I think in this this COVID era, if we are going to build back better, one of the things that I really, really hope that we get rid of is the aid model, because you can Google every single day the TED Talks by Africans who are leading in their industries and in their countries, and none of them ever say that we need more aid. They say we need more democracy in the way that we have conversations with global leaders and the way that we're invested in. And for me, as an African in the diaspora, I really just want to be able to say that is, let's not feel uncomfortable about actually really talking about supporting Africa to develop as a trading continent as opposed to an aid-dependent continent.
Mm-hmm. Economic empowerment, democracy, the right to make people's decisions on their own terms with their own knowledge. I mean, that is a key part of equality. Nimco, the final thing I wanted to ask is this. The Build Back Better idea, it needs to be replaced, doesn't it? You said build back differently, build back completely differently. Do you think that the ideas are in place imaginatively in places of power where the real power are already starting building recovery plans? Do you see that women's voices and radical change models are circling around those environments at the moment? And if they're not, what do we do about it?
Unfortunately, they're not. There are big conversations that are being had about the environment, about the economy, about all these things, and they're all very gender blind. And even the massive philanthropies will have data on poverty and all these things, but really forget about women being at the heart of it. I think what we really need to do is to deconstruct the way that we want to be able to build this. So the men that are holding the tools need to put them down and actually just listen for a moment. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to get global leaders to listen and really start to platform women and communities that are the ones that are going to be able to sustain a better world for us. So it's not about building better, it's building differently for a better world.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to say something very key here for the WOW charity. As a small charity, we're doing all of this over these 24 hours with help from our global partners that are going to thank shortly. But we are doing it for free in order that girls and women can have access to these conversations, provided they have digital tools, which many, many don't. But if they do, we want them to have no financial barrier. And we're planning in the autumn, as part of the Day of the Girl, to do a similar event, a global Day of the Girl. If you'd like to support that, please press the donate button or sign up to our website newsletter. Let us know that you'd like to be part of this conversation, because girls need their rights as much as women need their rights, and they need to know that their voices are cared for. Nimco, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to turn now to our final speaker, Olga Miller. Olga, you are somebody who has worked in the financial services for a long time. You're a global innovation expert. You're specializing in women and finance, sustainability, and gender smart investment. You're a former managing director at UBS Wealth Management, and you've co-founded SmartPurse, which is a financial toolkit for women. We need different ways of having conversations with girls and women, I believe, don't we? About financial inclusion, about financial confidence, about financial rights. Can you tell me what you think is happening across the kind of fintech landscape at the moment, and how much are we taking into account the needs of girls and women's independence financially at this point in time?
So thank you, Jude. I think there are two things that are happening at this point in time. One is there are a lot of disruptive solutions being developed as part of, I would say, the grassroots fintech, right? My own or this startup is one example of it, and there are many, many others. And on the other hand, there is this massive financial services institutions which acknowledge that something has to change, but the change is incredibly slow, most likely too slow. And then I think there is a third component to all of it, and I think it was Julia who said it before, where a lot of the government development packages, helpful packages, have not really been designed with a gender lens. I would argue that many of them have not even been designed with women and girls and what, for instance, women entrepreneurs would need in mind. And I guess this is for me probably the biggest root of the challenge. We need more women at the decision-making roles when financial services solutions are being designed, rather than trying to plug them into the system later on and say, oh, we also need to do something for the women. So I would love to see far more women in decision-making roles in financial services institutions, the chief investment officers, the heads of product, the heads of customer experience, rather than relying on a very agile and brilliant fintech community that will, however, always drive systemic change from the sideline.
Mm-hmm. But when people think about fintech, it always feels at the moment as if it's propping up and serving the idea of economic growth that is making some people really very well off, if not extremely rich, and doesn't take into account the fact that a huge part of the population of any part of the world are actually living in poverty, need different kinds of instruments. So how do we close the gap to stop the financial services always looking as if they're really serving the people who know how to make money and want to make more of it for themselves?
I think sound financial education and impartial solutions are probably two of the answers. The third one is to design and develop really accessible, and I mean by accessible, I mean really easy financial services products that actually are designed around the people that they are meant to serve, right? I don't see any other way, and these solutions have to be designed by a mixed team and with the people in mind that they are meant to serve, not coming top down saying, oh, here is a fabulous tool, now you are due to use that for your budgeting. But it all starts also with educating the people that are meant to use these tools, what their rights are, how easy it actually is to be good with money, and on some of the basic aspects of finance. To give you one example now just from Britain, out of the 10 things that British people wish they had learned at school, 5 relate to money, and number 1 was to have sound budgeting skills.
Mm-hmm. And because we have a history of women not being allowed to own money, not being able to allow to use money, not even be able to have their own bank accounts, their own checkbooks, the idea that women actually are property, it's really psychologically quite difficult for some of us to realize that we are actually entitled to be paid properly, to not be undervalued, to not to do free labor, but actually to think of ourselves as part of the economic rights and the economic growth of a nation that will be adjusted to take account of how we want to live our own lives.
Well, absolutely. I think it is an enormously pivotal point. I mean, the female purse, with women holding roughly 40% of the global private wealth in their hand and influencing 80% of the purchasing decisions, we have to make that purse matter and not ask for permission. Yet staggeringly, you see on the stats that 6 out of 10 women actually delegate financial responsibility to their partners voluntarily because they feel that they don't know enough. And that comes back to this point of inclusive financial education. But I think it also comes to a point of, while we are waiting for, the financial services industry to change or for governments to design a solution that also has women and girls in mind, I think we have to step forward and develop our own support system, women supporting other women, women supplying philanthropic capital that, for instance, as Nimco mentioned, right, is not just development aid, but is actually providing actual solutions. I think there is also a lot of power in ourselves, not to end up as victims, but end up as change makers of this crisis beyond having led through the viruses over to actually how economy is being shaped in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Olga. This idea of financial education and girls and women having the right and access to it, that's an important part of building back differently, not just better. Julia, let me come to you for a final word before I do all the thank yous for this extraordinary 24-hour experience. Let's just talk about building back better. What do you want to send us away with? If you were going to give us a message, you said, okay, you've already said, be hopeful, but don't be complacent. Be ready and on the alert for the fact that we could row back very quickly from this moment of drama and people could cover up the traces very quickly. What do we need to do to make sure that we take advantage of the crisis in the best way?
I'm going to pinch a line from Olga. She just said that there is power in us, that there is power in women, and I absolutely believe that. I think, firstly, feel that power. Second, it's fine to be angry about how slow the rate of change is. Feel that anger, feel that impatience for change. Third, as we look to build a better world post this crisis, seize the moment. I know that many of us have gone into this feeling like we've spent many years in activism. Perhaps some of us even feel like we've spent many years banging heads against brick walls. But I do think that it is possible to make change. And when the world has been through such a huge event, that does give us opportunities. So let's not miss this moment. None of us is going to have all of the solutions in our heads or in our hands. They're only going to be found collectively, which is why staying in contact, staying in touch, hearing women's voices, listening to each other, bringing us together 24 hours across the world is just so important to this process and this era of change. So let's keep doing this. Learn from it, take it away, be active with it, then come back together again and get the next dose of what we need to learn and next dose of energy and go and do it again.
Thank you. And Nimco, as a black woman leader, tell us what you think the next steps should be.
I think the next step should be really listening and getting this, myth out of our minds that without any funding, that black women are just going to be able to carry on and keep doing things. And when I say black women, I mean specifically African women. They have kept the continent going for the last 60 years without any funding, without any support. And I think if we are going to build back better, we have to start funding them and start believing in the power of African women. So I really want to say specifically, let's really harness the power of African women.
Thank you. I want to spend a couple of minutes now thanking the wonderful teams that have helped us do this 24-hour marathon. Obviously, thank you to all our speakers, our hosts, our panelists, the WOW Sounds and the WOW Big Ideas contributions over the 24 hours. Thank you to the WOW Foundation's Global 24-hour team. You might be surprised by how small it is. Sabina Akhtar, Lou Brody, Casherelle Brown, Catherine Fenton, Alice Gordon, Daniela Jenkins, Charlie Marshall, Cordelia Millwood, Domino Pateman, Kate Pakenham, Shireen Pereira, Laura Schofield, Pia Zicci, and all their partners, families, friends and housemates who've helped and kept us awake all weekend, and especially Andrew. And then our technical team at the Banufu e-conferencing, Devon Martin, Jennifer Dunn, Hardeep Tour, Vikesh Doshi and their teams, the TEA Films, the performance interpreters, the BSL interpreters, Stage Techs and MyClear Techs, all the global channel partners, Care International, Connected Women Leaders, Disasters Emergency Fund, Reach All Women in War, Their World, UN Women, With and For Girls, Janet's List, The Female Lead, all the local channel partners across Red Lines in the Middle East, Ake Arts and Book Festival on the African continent, the British Council, South Asia and Turkey, Jagriti Women's Centre of Excellence in India, Redes de Mare in Brazil, WOW Australia, Of One Mind in Australia and the Pacific, WOW Bradford UK, WOW Malaysia, WOW USA. Thanks to all the global 24-hour festival supporters, Arts Council, Bloomberg, Moody's, and the 24-hour partners who helped us enormously. Shout out for you guys. And the WOW Foundation supporters year round. Bloomberg, always Bloomberg. They've been with us from the beginning. We'll never forget them and always love them. MasterCard, who've just joined us, Esme Fairbairn Foundation, and all our individual patrons and foundation builders. Thanks to everybody who's donated over this weekend. And of course, it's not too late. We wanted to make this festival completely free. Every donation means so much. And actually, thank you. Ooh, we're going to cry. Thank you, all the girls and women whose voices haven't been part of this because they're not able to be here. They're silenced. They're made too vulnerable. They're not safe. Thank you to them, because it's their stories that we're learning and that are teaching us why our world is so unjust. And it's their stories that fire us on as we say we cannot carry on having such an inequity in our world. We deserve to give girls a different future, whoever they are, wherever they are, whatever our cultural histories have taught us. We have to make it different. There should be no girl child born unable to realize their dreams and their potential. Any woman who've been on this 24 hours, we got here because other people fought for our rights to have a voice. And it's our job to carry on making that fight happen for the next generation. And you wouldn't be listening if you weren't prepared to do that. But should we just do it harder and better? And should we do it all together? I hope so. So thanks to everybody. That's the end of the WOW Marathon. I think I'll go and have a sleep.